The greatest civilization the ancient world ever produced did not fall in a single battle. It did not end with a flood, a plague, or the cry of an invading army. It died slowly, quietly, over centuries, and almost nobody noticed until it was already gone. Here is the truth that most history books skip over entirely. By the time the last pharaoh sat upon the throne of Egypt, the office of pharaoh had already been hollow for nearly 1,000 years. The god-kings who had once commanded armies flooded the Nile on a divine whim and filled the sky with monuments of impossible scale had, long before the very end, become little more than ceremonial figures, propped up by foreign generals, manipulated by priests, and slowly written out of their own story. The fall of ancient Egypt was not a sudden catastrophe. It was a long, aching unraveling, a civilization slowly forgetting who it was, one dynasty at a time. If that surprises you, stay with us. Because what we are about to walk through is not just the political collapse of a kingdom. It is something far more haunting, the story of a people who once believed their ruler was a literal living god, watching that belief erode in real time, replaced first by doubt, then by foreign kings wearing Egyptian crowns, and finally by the cold, administrative efficiency of Rome. Subscribe now and keep watching, because this is the story history rarely tells. Not the glory of Egypt at its peak, but the long, complicated, deeply human story of how it all came apart. To truly understand the fall, you have to begin not at the end, but at the moment when the cracks first appeared. And that moment comes earlier than almost anyone expects. Cast your mind back to around 1070 BCE, the New Kingdom, that extraordinary era of Ramesses the Great, of Tutankhamun, of the Battle of Kadesh, of temples carved directly into living rock at Abu Simbel, is over. The last of the great warrior pharaohs, Ramesses XI, has just died. And what he leaves behind is not a unified, triumphant empire. He leaves behind a kingdom fractured right down the middle. In the north, around the ancient capital of Memphis and the Delta, a line of pharaohs will continue to rule, at least in name. But in the south, in the sacred city of Thebes, the high priests of Amun have quietly, methodically accumulated so much wealth, so much land, and so much political influence that they are now effectively a parallel government. They control the army in the south. They control the temples, which in Egypt were not merely places of worship, but vast economic engines, employers, granaries, landowners, banks. The high priest of Amun at Thebes is, by any practical measure, as powerful as the pharaoh himself, and he knows it. This is the period that Egyptologists call the Third Intermediate Period, and it is one of the most underappreciated eras in all of ancient history, because it is here, in this long, messy, confusing stretch of fragmented rule, that you can watch the ideology of divine kingship begin to quietly fall apart. The pharaoh was supposed to be the son of Ra, the earthly embodiment of Horus, the guarantor of Ma'at, the cosmic order of truth, justice, and balance that kept the universe running. If the pharaoh was weak, Ma'at collapsed. Crops would fail. The Nile would not flood correctly. Chaos, what the Egyptians called Isfet, would swallow everything. That was not metaphor. That was, for 3,000 years, genuinely believed cosmological fact. But now, a high priest in the south is issuing royal decrees in his own name. Now, two separate lines of kings are claiming the double crown simultaneously. And the ordinary people of Egypt, the farmers in the Delta, the craftsmen of Thebes, the soldiers manning the frontier forts in Nubia, are watching this happen and drawing their own quiet, dangerous conclusions. If there can be two pharaohs, perhaps the pharaoh is not quite so divine as advertised. And then the outsiders arrive. And this is where the story becomes genuinely extraordinary, because the outsiders do not come as conquerors in the traditional sense. They come as something far more complicated. Around 945 BCE, a Libyan military commander named Shoshenq seizes the throne of Egypt and founds an entirely new dynasty, the 22nd dynasty. He is not Egyptian by birth. His family roots lie in the Libyan desert to the west, where for generations Libyan clans had been settling in the Egyptian delta, serving in the Egyptian army, intermarrying with Egyptian families, adopting Egyptian customs and religion. Shoshenq is, in many respects, culturally Egyptian. He worships the Egyptian gods. He builds temples in the Egyptian style. He has himself depicted in hieroglyphs as the son of Ra, exactly as every pharaoh before him had done. And yet, and this is the quietly devastating detail, he is not Egyptian. The living embodiment of Horus, the divine intermediary between gods and men, the cornerstone of Egyptian civilization for over 2,000 years, is now a Libyan general who happened to be in the right place at the right time. The throne of the Pharaohs, which once seemed as permanent and eternal as the pyramids themselves, has become something you can simply take if you are powerful enough. What follows is a period of breathtaking political chaos that even specialists find difficult to follow. At one point, historians estimate that there are as many as 5 or 6 kings simultaneously claiming to be the legitimate pharaoh of Egypt, ruling different regions of the country with no apparent resolution in sight. The delta is carved up between competing Libyan dynasties. Thebes is controlled by God's wives of Amun, a line of royal women who hold religious and political authority in the south, and who deliberately remain celibate, adopting their successors rather than producing biological heirs, creating their own entirely separate power structure, entirely independent of the pharaoh. It is, in modern terms, something like imagining the United Kingdom simultaneously ruled by the king in London, a rival king in Edinburgh, a military governor in Cardiff, and a religious council in York, all issuing their own currencies, all claiming supreme authority, and none of them strong enough to eliminate the others. Egypt is still Egypt. The temples are still standing. The priests are still conducting the rituals. The farmers are still flooding their fields. But the central pillar of Egyptian civilization, the singular, sacred, unquestioned authority of the divine pharaoh, is gone, possibly forever. Then, from the south, comes a force that nobody in the delta is expecting. Around 747 BCE, a Nubian king named Piye sweeps north out of the kingdom of Kush, the powerful African civilization that had grown up along the Nile in what is now Sudan, and proceeds to conquer Egypt almost entirely on his own terms. What makes Piye's conquest so utterly fascinating is his motivation. He is not coming to loot Egypt or enslave its people. He is coming, by his own account, to save it. The Kushites had absorbed Egyptian culture so completely. The religion, the hieroglyphs, the artistic styles, the concept of divine kingship, that Piye genuinely considers the fractured, Libyan-ruled Egypt of his day to be a desecration. He is a devout worshipper of Amun. He finds the irreverence of the Delta kings toward the old Egyptian gods deeply offensive. He is, in a profound historical irony, an African king from Sudan conquering Egypt in order to restore authentic Egyptian tradition. He succeeds. He plants his victory stela at Karnak, a magnificent stone inscription that records his campaign in vivid detail, including the moment when various Delta kings come to submit to him, and he refuses to let some of them approach because they are ritually unclean, having eaten fish, a food considered impure in Egyptian sacred tradition. Piye goes home to Nubia, and his successors, the 25th dynasty, rule Egypt as pharaohs, building pyramids back in Sudan, worshipping Amun with extraordinary devotion and producing some of the finest artistic work in the entire late period of Egyptian history. But their reign will be short, because from the east, a power is rising that makes every previous conqueror of Egypt look modest by comparison. The Assyrian Empire, at the height of its terrifying military expansion, turns its eyes toward the Nile Valley. The Assyrians are not interested in Egyptian religion or Egyptian tradition. They are interested in resources, in tribute, in the submission of kingdoms. In 671 BCE, the Assyrian king Esarhaddon invades Egypt and sacks Memphis. In 667 BCE, his successor Ashurbanipal pushes even further south and sacks Thebes itself, the holy city, the city of Amun, the spiritual heart of Egypt for over 1,000 years. He strips the temples. He carries off their gold. The Kushite pharaoh flees back to Nubia and does not return. The psychological impact of the Assyrian sack of Thebes cannot be overstated. The Egyptians had believed, with complete theological sincerity, that their gods protected them, that Egypt itself, the sacred land, the gift of the Nile, the domain of Horus and Ra, was under divine protection, that no foreign army could penetrate. Assyrian soldiers walking out of the temples of Thebes carrying armfuls of sacred gold objects was not merely a military defeat. It was a theological catastrophe. It meant that either the gods had chosen not to protect Egypt, or, and this is the thought that must have been almost unbearable, that the gods could not. The Assyrians withdraw, as foreign powers periodically do, and for a brief, glittering moment, Egypt recovers under the 26th dynasty, the Saite period, named for the delta city of Sai. These pharaohs are Egyptian by heritage, and they preside over what feels, from the outside, like a renaissance. They build extensively. They commission extraordinary art. They look deliberately backward to the great periods of Egyptian history, to the Old Kingdom, the age of the pyramid builders, and consciously imitate that aesthetic, as if by copying the forms of the past they can recapture its power. It is a deeply revealing impulse. A civilization that is genuinely confident in itself does not look backward for reassurance. A civilization that is quietly uncertain of its own future reaches for the anchoring weight of its greatest memories. And then, in 525 BCE, everything changes again. Cambyses II, the king of Persia, invades. The Persian Empire at this moment is the largest empire the world has ever seen, stretching from the Aegean Sea to the borders of India. Egypt, for all its ancient prestige, for all its monuments and its theology, and its 3,000-year history, is simply the next territory on the list. The last Site pharaoh, Psamtik III, is defeated at the Battle of Pelusium. Egypt becomes a Persian province, a satrapy, an administrative unit in someone else's empire. The Persians are not entirely without respect for Egyptian tradition. Cambyses participates in some Egyptian religious ceremonies. His successors take on pharaonic titles, have themselves depicted in Egyptian artistic conventions, engage with the Egyptian priesthood. But they are Persian kings first. Egypt is a conquered territory, and the Egyptians know it. There are repeated uprisings, periods of brief native rule, a remarkable period in the 4th century BCE, when Egyptian pharaohs briefly reclaim independence. But the days of Egypt as a self-determining, independently powerful civilization are drawing to their close. When Alexander the Great arrives in 332 BCE, the Egyptians greet him not with resistance, but with something approaching relief. He is liberating them from Persia, the most recent in a long line of foreign masters. The priests of Amun at the Siwa oasis proclaim him the son of Amun, which is to say, the son of the god, which is to say, by Egyptian theological logic, a legitimate pharaoh. Alexander accepts the title. He visits Memphis. He lays out the plans for a new city on the Mediterranean coast, Alexandria, that will become one of the greatest cities the ancient world ever produces. And then he leaves, and within a decade he is dead, and Egypt passes to one of his generals, Ptolemy. The Ptolemaic dynasty that follows is one of history's great experiments in cultural fusion. The Ptolemies are Macedonian Greeks. They speak Greek. Their court operates in Greek. Alexandria, their capital, is essentially a Greek city built on Egyptian soil, a metropolis of libraries, gymnasiums, philosophical schools, and Greek theatrical performances, buzzing with the intellectual energy of the Hellenistic world. But the Ptolemies are also shrewd political operators, and they understand from the very beginning that to rule Egypt, you must engage with Egyptian religion and Egyptian tradition. So they build temples. Magnificent ones. The temples at Edfu and Dendera and Philae, with their vast stone walls covered in meticulously carved hieroglyphs, were built by Greek-speaking Macedonian kings. The hieroglyphic inscriptions name the Ptolemies as sons of Ra, beloved of Amun, lord of the two lands. All the ancient titles, perfectly rendered, perfectly positioned, performing the role of divine kingship for the Egyptian population, while simultaneously drinking wine at Greek symposia and corresponding with philosophers in perfect Attic Greek. It is a remarkable balancing act, and for a time, it works extraordinarily well. But as the dynasty ages, the cracks appear again. Dynastic infighting becomes savage and near constant. Brothers murder sisters. Sisters outlive brothers and rule alone. A series of weak, troubled rulers presides over an Egypt that is increasingly dependent on Rome. First as an ally, then as a patron, then as something uncomfortably close to a protector, and finally as a master. Egypt's grain is feeding Rome's expanding population. Rome's legions are maintaining order in Alexandria. The relationship has only one possible direction of travel. And then comes Cleopatra, Cleopatra VII, to be precise, the last and most famous of the Ptolemaic rulers, the final person to hold the title of pharaoh for an independent Egypt. She is, by any measure, a figure of startling political intelligence. She is, famously, the first ruler of her dynasty in nearly 3 centuries who actually bothered to learn Egyptian. She spoke it fluently, along with at least 8 other languages. She understood that to hold Egypt together, she needed the Egyptian people and the Egyptian priests, not just the Greek-speaking elite of Alexandria. She performed the rituals. She visited the temples. She cultivated the image of Isis, the great mother goddess, with deliberate, sophisticated political intent. She also understood, with cold clarity, that Egypt's only hope of remaining independent lay in the outcome of Rome's own internal power struggles. She aligned herself first with Julius Caesar, by whom she had a son, a boy named Caesarion, whom she declared to be the son of Caesar and the last legitimate heir of Egypt. After Caesar's assassination, she aligned herself with Mark Antony, Rome's most powerful general in the East, in a relationship that was both deeply personal and relentlessly political. Together they dreamed of something extraordinary, a combined Greco-Egyptian Roman Eastern Empire, ruled from Alexandria, that might hold off the cold administrative ambitions of Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir who was steadily consolidating power in Rome. That dream died at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. Octavian's navy defeated the combined fleet of Antony and Cleopatra off the coast of Greece, and whatever hope remained of an independent Egyptian future evaporated with it. Antony killed himself. Cleopatra, outmaneuvered, her children's futures uncertain, and reportedly unwilling to be paraded through Rome in chains as a trophy of Octavian's triumph, chose death on her own terms. The method of her death remains one of history's most debated mysteries. The story of the asp, the venomous snake, is poetic and ancient, but almost certainly untrue. The logistics are implausible. But the fact of her death is not in doubt. In 30 BCE, Cleopatra VII of Egypt died, and with her died the last pharaoh. 3,000 years of divine kingship, of the son of Ra, of the living Horus, of the guarantor of Ma'at, ended not with a declaration or a battle, but with the quiet death of a woman in a locked room. Octavian, soon to style himself Augustus, the first Roman emperor, was deeply nervous about Egypt. He refused to allow any Roman senator of significant political standing to visit Egypt without his personal permission. He understood, perhaps better than any outsider before him, that Egypt was not merely a province. It was a psychological force, a civilization so ancient, so weighted with religious meaning, so central to the mythology of the entire Mediterranean world, that whoever controlled it held something more than territory. He took the title of Pharaoh. He had himself depicted in Egyptian temples in the traditional artistic style, striding, broad-shouldered, offering to the gods in exactly the manner that Thutmose III and Rameses the Great had done. Roman emperors would maintain this practice for centuries, performing divine kingship in Egyptian temples long after the rest of the world had moved on to other gods. But the living pulse of Egyptian civilization was fading. The temples kept operating. The priests kept performing the ancient rituals. Hieroglyphs kept being carved. But the number of people who could read them was shrinking. Greek and later Coptic, the final form of the ancient Egyptian language, written in a Greek-derived alphabet, were replacing hieroglyphs for everyday communication. By the 3rd century CE, the ability to read and write hieroglyphs had become the preserve of a tiny, specialized priestly class. By the 4th century, it was barely that. The last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved at Philae, a temple on an island at the Nile's first cataract, on the 24th of August, 394 CE. It was carved by a priest named Esmet Akhom, and it commemorates the birthday of the god Horus. It is a perfectly formed, properly composed hieroglyphic text, exactly as hieroglyphs had been carved for 3,500 years. And it is the last. Within decades, nobody would be left who could read it. The temples closed. Christianity, now the official religion of the Roman Empire, swept through Egypt with remarkable speed. The old gods, Ra, Osiris, Horus, Isis, Amun, were not immediately forgotten. Isis in particular persisted, her cult spreading across the Roman world, her imagery influencing early Christian depictions of the Virgin Mary in ways that scholars still debate. But as a living religious practice, with priests performing daily rituals, with temple economies supporting entire communities, with the full theological apparatus of divine kingship intact, it was gone. What replaced it was not nothing. Egypt became one of the most vibrant centers of early Christianity in the entire world. Egyptian monks pioneered the tradition of Christian monasticism that would spread throughout medieval Europe. The Coptic Church, which traces its founding to the evangelist Mark, has maintained continuous worship in Egypt from the 1st century to the present day. Egypt did not disappear. Its people did not disappear. The Nile did not disappear. But the ancient Egyptian civilization, that extraordinary, 3,500-year-long experiment in human organization, theology, art, and governance, had come to its end. And perhaps the most remarkable thing about that ending is how long it took. Most empires fall in a generation or a century. Egypt's decline took the better part of 1,000 years, a long, slow process of fragmentation, foreign rule, cultural dilution, and gradual loss of the central animating belief that had held it all together. That the pharaoh was divine, that Egypt was sacred, that Ma'at, truth, balance, cosmic order, was a thing a human being could actually uphold. The pyramids still stand, of course. The temples at Karnak and Luxor still stand. The hieroglyphs are still there, carved into stone with a precision and permanence that puts everything we have built in the modern world to quiet shame. They outlasted every empire that conquered Egypt, every king who took the pharaonic title for himself, every foreign power that stripped the temples and declared the old gods dead. They are still standing, patient and magnificent, in the Egyptian sun, not as reminders of what was lost, but as evidence of what was once improbably, magnificently, humanly possible. The pharaohs are gone, but the stones remember everything.